Welcome to the Anxiety Crusher series. So this is a series I'm doing. It's using my 7-step reset model, which is designed for transformation, and applying it to anxiety because there are similarities in both of those. And I'll show you an illustration of that in a moment. The reason I have the 7-step reset is my audience is over 50. Transformation After 50 is my podcast. And the majority of our conditioning occurs from age 0 to 7. So if you take a 50-year-old today, there are so many things that they learn that's deep in their conditioning that no longer applies. And that reset is what we're doing is resetting the master system. Now, the people will think that behavior, a habit is can't be changed. That behavior can't be changed. That it's locked in, especially as you at 50 years old. I've had people, yeah, you can't change. It's impossible to change habit. I challenge you. So come on, let's talk about it. You can come online. I'll actually put it in the chat. The URL where you can join me on stage. And this goes for every day. This URL works every day. Not only is habit change possible, it's actually much more accessible than people think. The challenge is that the model is wrong. The model that people use is wrong. Now, when I say wrong, the majority of it is correct, but it misses two really important points. And if you go back to the New Thought era, which was around 1850 to 1940 or so, and that was brought about by the philosophers sharing information and the advent of the printing press. Those two things came together and caused an explosion of written literature. William James, late 1800s, Law of Attraction, late 1800s. Then you had Dale Carnegie in 1900s, Wallace Wattles, early 1900s, Florence Shinn, Game of Life, early. All these folks who were talking about the power of they called it the subconscious mind. And the reason it's called the mind is because they didn't have the scanning tools available back then to understand what was going on with the network of neurons. That's why you'll hear me say network of neurons, aka subconscious. But when I do say subconscious, I won't call it a mind. I won't give it that much credit because it's not a mind. A mind can think, it can relate the unrelated, it can create in the field of infinite possibilities. The subconscious network of neurons is all associations. The more you look into this work, the more you'll see that physics is at play. And it makes sense as to how the ancient philosophers were able to get it so right, other than this one part about the network of neurons, because they looked at nature. And if everything is atoms, if you agree with that, and that's the more of the quantum view of physics versus the Newtonian view of physics, once you see that everything is atoms, you can see why you can look at a plant. You can look at how water moves. Bruce Lee talked about this a lot. You can look at how water moves, and you get understanding about why things are the way they are. Now, the 7 performance areas is why I have the 7-step reset. The 7 performance areas is the model I use in helping people go through the transformation. That transformation is to first get a handle on the things that are in our control. The mental, physical, spiritual. When I say spiritual, I'm talking about the higher self, and then the emotional. So mental, physical, spiritual, everyone would agree this is in your control. The emotional is also in your control, but people may feel like they can't do anything about it. So I know people who are deep into emotional intelligence, and they are still working. They know this stuff, and they are still working on regulating in difficult situations. What I'm telling you is that none of this has to be a thing. We put emotional in your charge too. So now we have these 4 are in your control: mental, physical, spiritual, emotional are all in your control. And it's important to have emotional there because emotional is the gateway to the things where you need to interact with other people. So the relationships, professional and financial, when you have goals over here and quests that involve these, you have to involve other people. You can't have a relationship without other people, professional, even financial, even if you're a trader, every buyer still needs a seller. So we first get a handle on this, and like to say we do laps around this. Sort of facilitate those laps, I use the 7-step reset because there's always links, and we're always pushing on it, and we're trying to break it. The reason we want to break it is to find that next weak link so that we can fix this sort of in the lab rather than out in the real world. And then once this is reasonably in place, we start the quest, relationship, professional, and financial, the real work, and we'll continue to break it. So that's where people get triggered, they run into things, and this triggering, this triggering that's coming up is part of why I apply the 7-step reset to anxiety and calling it the anxiety crusher and stopping the spiral before it even starts. So this is not mental health. It's about business anxiety. It's about dealing with the VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and not letting it become our experience, which ends up being the BANI, right? Brittle, anxiety, or anxiousness, brittle anxiousness, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. That's the experience that we have because it's just coming at us. And what I like to say is the VUCA is not going away. You're not going to put that toothpaste back in the tube because part of it is the result of the exponential curve that technology has been on for the last 50 years, more than 50 years. In the early 70s, Moore's Law said that, and this was the CEO of Intel at the time, that the technology capability will double every 18 months. And it moved around every year, every 18 months, every 2 years, but they settled in 18 months by 72. And if you double anything more than 20 times, you're on a very steep vertical part of that exponential curve. This is why you can see artificial intelligence being new versions of artificial intelligence being created that are a fraction of the cost. So OpenAI, several $100 million, and there was and then you had DeepSeek that was a fraction of that, and then just recently another company came up with an artificial intelligence system that was less than $5 million, and all this is within a couple of years. So this is what I'm talking about. That's why I'm saying it's not going away, which is why I'm doing this work, because people have to have a way to maintain agency no matter what's going on around them, and that's the model. No matter what's the chaos, that you can maintain agency and you can have coherence. Today we're talking about physiology, and you're going to see some parallels with physiology and start to make that connection that, wow, this really is the network of neurons. A big part of this is that humans make about 33,000 decisions a day. So that's a stimulus response cycle every other second, assuming we're awake about 65,000 seconds, and assuming that 95% of everything we do is done by habit. And that number has been around. I first heard it in the 70s, but I heard it from people who were 40 and 50 years old. And so at least 2 lifetimes, I know they've been saying 95% of everything we do is done by habit. And if you Google it today, you still come up with that same number. And I accept it. That number is certainly true in my own experience. So if you look at that, then this 33,000 decisions per day is more like 31,500 stimulus response cycles, and then a little bit of conscious mind sprinkled in there. Real decisions. So most of our experience is habitual. Now, when you look at habitual behavior, that becomes the person's personality. And we say, well, they are not their behaviors. That's true. But when I say so-and-so did X, Y, and Z, or so-and-so's personality is this, I'm actually describing their behaviors, their personality, which means they can actually change their personality by changing their behaviors. How do you change your behaviors? You change them at the habitual level. The reason why habits are so difficult in people's mind to change, and they're not, but the reason why people perceive them to be difficult to change is because people believe that habits live in the mind. Habits don't live in the mind. They live in the network of neurons, and that's the big deal. They live in the network of neurons. And today, and with the physiology, so I'm doing physiology today, and I'll talk about it again for part two, and then rather than have a part three of physiology, I'll use physiology in step two. So we're in step one right now: beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, mindset, and then physiology. Step two is like a dashboard where we're checking in to make sure that we're in that powerful present moment state. And if we're not, do something on purpose to get back there. So we have tools to get back to a powerful present moment instantly, as well as making it your status quo. And that's what we want. We want the status quo to be powerful present moment, but we recognize things happen. The more you do this work, the less and less you'll experience getting knocked off kilter, having to regulate. It just doesn't happen anymore, and there's reasons why. And then we have the 7-step reset. So this is the big deal right here, the 7-step reset. And you have step one, which is where we are: beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, mindset, physiology. As I said, step two, the virtual check-in and adjust. So it's like mental, physical, spiritual, emotional state. What's your state of being, and also your self-image. But I'm going to use physiology as, because it is such a important part of it in here, and we'll use physiology as the KPI, so to speak. And then we have the conditioned reaction. The conditioned reaction happens in a half a second. I have 250 milliseconds, right? There's 250 milliseconds reaction time, and then another 250 milliseconds where the subconscious is processing, the network of neurons is processing. And then at a half second approximately, that's when the conscious mind can kick in. It doesn't always kick in right away. That's why they'll say if a person talking on a cell phone, even if it's hands-free, has a reaction time of someone who's alcohol impaired. That's because if you are engaged in something else, your conscious mind sort of has to drop that thing and then pick up the other thing. And so you add another 100 to 200 milliseconds. So this is why that reaction time could be 3/4 of a second versus a half a second. But this is where the real life happens. This is the quarter to a half second, but it starts during that 250 millisecond reaction time. The subconscious is not just waiting to receive information. What's going on is the cognitive biases. We've got mental heuristics, meta programs are happening in there. There's a check-in to see where we are. In fact, priming is actually already listening before the stimulus even happens. It's like those recorders that pick up the audio and the video. When you push the record button, it picks it up what was going on 2 seconds before to make it cleaner, your recording cleaner. It's similar to that you're always primed for a stimulus. So whatever stimulus happens, the priming that's immediately before that is applied, right? So you're always being primed. And it's very, very important to understand priming. And then we get into the step 4, and there's a pause. We build a pause in here so that step 4 is the response. We don't want the response to equal the reaction, so that's why we have that pause. But if you don't do this kind of work, by 50, most people's response will equal their reaction, and this is very visible when you see somebody being triggered. And then we have the emotional modulation. That's an optional step if needed. And again, if you do this work on the pre-stimulus side, you'll find that you don't need the emotional modulation. And the emotional modulation is where you make sure you get back to that present moment before you take action. So this whole thing is less than a second, but if you do need to do the emotional modulation, we add the 0 to 90 seconds onto it right here, and then the action, and then we go back to mindfulness step. So this is for the individual. This is how it looks for the individual. It's very fractal. It works at the micro level, it works at the mid level, it works at the macro level. And what I do next, the next phase I'll get into is the leadership. So 1-to-1, and then we'll do leadership 1-to-many. And this same 7-step applies, except that the leader, we're focusing on step 7, 1, and 2. 7, 1, and 2. The people reporting to them are doing the action. They're the ones going through 3, 4, 5, 6. but the leaders have to create the environment. And you've heard culture eats strategy for lunch, and companies spend millions of dollars over a lifetime on strategy, and it would be a lot cheaper to fix culture. And people think, well, you can't fix culture. Culture eats strategy for lunch, but you can fix culture because culture is a roll up of the collective habits. And as you do this work, so this 7 step even applies at the corporate level. If I'm looking at the corporate level, we're doing these steps are not happening in quarters of a second. These steps are happening in quarters or longer. This could be a 2 year cycle. This could be a 2 year process where you change culture, and you have to start changing at the leadership level, but you do change leadership at the frontline level. Beyond the scope of this, but we'll get into that probably in February. We'll get into the one to many, which would be the culture. For now, I'm talking about anxiety because I want people to be able to understand it. And once you understand it that way, it makes it easy to apply. And that's the biggest challenge, is having people be able to apply this work in a way that's seamless, so they don't have to think about it. You've heard the thing, you want to go from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence to conscious competence to unconscious competence. And that's where we want to get to, is unconscious competence. And when you're in unconscious competence, that's when you won't see the situations happening. So we're talking about physiology today. And physiology, this is, I'm going to just go through some stories here. So back in my teens, this started in my teens. There was a book, A Keto in Daily Life. I was big into martial arts. I was in a neighborhood where uh, this special forces guy, he created a system. So this was around the Bruce Lee time. So Bruce Lee created Jeet Kune Do. This special forces created Yaribu, and you can still find that online. There's another master right now still moving that Yaribu forward. And a lot of the people who came up under that school were bodyguards. And it was real. This was real, what I like to call real martial arts. It was before MMA, but these guys were serious. And then guns made their way into the cities, and you didn't see as many martial artists as bodyguards anymore. But one of the books that we were using was called The Keto in Daily Life. And that book is still available, A Keto in Daily Life. And there was a breathing exercise in this book that it had a 40-second exhale. It was very difficult, and you have to kneel in a very difficult position. I didn't make the connection back then about how much of it was physiological. So we're always thinking it's changing the mind. We're doing something to the mind. And this arduous breathing practice, spend in that sitting position for 45 minutes to an hour, these long breathings, is one of the reasons why I pushed off meditation for so long, because that was such an arduous thing. Exhaling for 40 seconds and holding the breath for 30 seconds, that was difficult. And I recorded clappers. I recorded myself clapping, or like sandals clapping for the signal, and I would go through that meditation process. And then through that book, there were different, we call them like parlor tricks, right? Where you can have somebody's head and feet. That's it. The head and the feet are on each chair, and 3 people were sitting on the body. I never got to 3 people, but we did it with one. It was we could get one. We had the unbendable arm, where you do these breathing techniques, the unbreakable circle. So all these things, where you could get into this state through this breathing. Another example, there was so there were several people from my neighborhood as a teenager who were into this, and several stayed. So there's another gentleman, he's well into his 70s, and he stayed with Aikido, an Aikido master, stayed with it all this time. And this guy made a post, and he said he started using the Wim Hof method 5 years ago. And he said he swears by it. He would tell anybody that they should drop what they're doing and use the Wim Hof method. Now, for somebody who's been into martial arts for 50 or 60 years and a master, and to say this one breathing method was so important, and remember, Aikido has a lot to do with breathing, and he said the Wim Hof method is so powerful, highly recommends it. That got my attention. And there's a book you can read, Just Breathe, by Dan Brule, Brule, I think it is, Dan Brule. Great book on breathing. This guy trained with special ops and uh, SEALs, and he brings some of that experience in. Very practical because he lived the experience and he used this breathing in life. So that was another example. Then you get to willpower. So the connection between willpower and heart rate variability, when I first heard that maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I struggled with seeing the connection. Now, what I understand, now that I understand heart rate variability, and I've learned more about willpower, and part of the challenge is we learn these things in silos, and the silos, the masters, so to speak, and the gurus of the silos don't necessarily talk to each other. So these things exist in silos. But when you have the experience across all of them, and you're looking across, and you're making it using a first principles thinking, and you're reconciling each one, then you start to see it. So understanding willpower without understanding I don't want power makes it harder. So I don't want power gets triggered when you start leaning into willpower. Willpower, we all know what that is. Willpower is more available to us in our teens and our 20s because partly because the prefrontal cortex is forming, and the prefrontal cortex has 20 billion neurons. So we have 100 billion neurons. The prefrontal cortex has 20 of those, 20 billion of those, and it's forming from age 19 to 27. Because of the forming of the prefrontal cortex, there's an abundance of neurotransmitter and synapses, which makes it easier for us to change behavior, myelinate neural pathways, activate neural pathways, and build strength in our neural pathways, strengthening the signal, and the abundance of dopamine. Dopamine, we know that's a habit formation neurotransmitter, but it's also a signal amplifier. And then you have serotonin, which is a mood enhancer. There's an abundance of serotonin during that time as well, and it's obviously easier to take on hard things when you have the good moods. But what happens is, in that, because of the conditioning that happens from 0 to 7, and then the tweaking of it from, I'll say, 8 to 19, that's where our personality comes in. It's adjusting. So you go from being in the alpha state all the time to sometimes being in the alpha state. And in the alpha state, you don't have to work for what you learn. It just downloads. There's a low bar for myelinating neurons, and myelinated neurons strengthen neural pathways. Neural pathways are where the habits live. And then from 19 or so to 27, obviously the ages will be slightly different from person to person, but that's when the prefrontal cortex is formed. And the I don't want power gets locked into the conditioning. What's the I don't want power? Let's say, like in my case, my mother didn't, so this is growing up in the 50s and 60s, my mother didn't like door-to-door salespeople. They literally were selling knives, and just like you've seen on TV and encyclopedias. And I remember the experience that my mother had when she would close the door after a door-to-door salesperson, and it was something I always felt like selling wasn't a good thing, and how am I going to be successful if I don't sell? And you can see where that could get locked in as, oh, I don't want to sell. And this is a great example of I don't want power. Fast forward in life, and I'm realizing I have some call reluctance, and and so I went through my initial work in neuro change was around getting past the call reluctance and also operating under pressure. But in working through that, you recognize that it was just a habit. 20 years later, I understand I don't want power, and then you see the connection. Now, when I would use willpower to push past the call reluctance, that triggers because associations are neural pathways, neurons that fire together wire together, and the ones that wire together fire together. So as I would lean into sales training and do something about that, I would also trigger the I don't want power. This led to me running national sales schools, running prospecting classes, teaching selling. It it completely removed all of the call reluctance through that process. But look, it was looking back that I got to see some of these things. People have I don't want power for lots of things, and you can hear it when somebody's saying I tried everything. Well, have you done this? I can't do that. I don't want to do that. What about this? Have you tried? Oh, I don't want to do that. I can't do that. And it comes up right away. I also talk about you can tell when something is coming from the conscious mind versus when it's coming from the network of neurons, aka subconscious, because of the speed. So the network of neurons processes information at 11 million bits per second and has a reaction time of a quarter of a second. The conscious mind processes at 50 bits per second, has a reaction time of a half second, roughly. And so when somebody's response comes that fast, it's actually not a response, it's a reaction. That is a network of neurons. And what's the processing in the network of neurons? Is energy going through the neural pathways. That's why people mistake it for thinking, because thinking at its most base level is also, or thought at its base level is also energy. So you have energy going through the neural pathways, and thought is energy. You can see why people think that those are the same, but with time you'll be able to distinguish when the difference. So one is speed. If it comes that fast, you're pretty certain, whether yourself or watching somebody. And if you just go look at some videos where people are being triggered and watch them. Watch the interaction. Watch their facial expression. Watch how they're telling tension. They can't let the other person stop talking. That's one way. The other way is if it comes up repeatedly. If it's repeated and comes back all the time, and this is it comes back as this is the reason, this is the reason, it's the stories, the beliefs, that's probably coming from the network of neurons. So those are two ways. But over time, you'll be able to discern the difference. That's a powerful step because you can just ignore many, many, many of that 33,000 stimuli that happen to us on a daily basis. So HRV, think of it this way. Everybody understands that your heart rate will change, right? You have machines at the gym and you look at your heart rate up and down. People have different heart rates. This is not changing the heart rate or not measuring the variation in the heartbeat rate. It's measuring the variation in the space between the heartbeats. So to make this make sense, imagine you just got finished doing high intensity intervals and your heart is beating as fast as it can beat. There would be very little variability in the space between each beat because the body's starving for blood and oxygen and it's pushing as hard as it can, so every space is used up. When you're in a completely calm state, when you're in a relaxed meditative state, your heart beats, the space between the heartbeats will vary, and the higher the variation or the variability, that's when you have higher willpower. So this is a measure of how calm you are. So there's a physiology of coherence, a physiology of communication, a physiology of presence, a physiology of agency, because it comes down to this, that variability. And because you're relaxed, It looks like my audio went out. I don't know how long it's been out. Let me just take a quick check. All right, I am going to have to start this over again. I didn't catch that the audio went out. Looks like my battery pack had an issue. Okay, let's close this one down and I'll come back.